So good morning, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to AI Voice Interview Program. Today we will continue our discussion from the interview last week on the revisiting Russia-Ukraine prolonged conflict, which we will continue the discussion with our guest of honor, Dr. Desmond Malloy, who is an independent political and conflict analyst and a lecturer at Panyasastra University of Cambodia. So, in terms of security and stability, we are aware that the U.S. is the major, the major assistant to Ukraine until since the war happened. So, if and Donald Trump has no interest, like you mentioned, in NATO and the security in Europe. So if the Donald Trump administration take the office in the U.S. and after the election at the end of the year, do you think the absence of the assistance from the U.S. and NATO will the Ukraine survive, and how the
Oh,
security in Europe?
if we consider at the moment that the GDP of the collective countries that oppose Russia in relation to the invasion of Ukraine is around $63 trillion, while Russian GDP is around $1.9 trillion. Even with the US out of the equation, you're talking about more than 40-50% of that difference in GDP power. So I think Europe will not stand by and watch Ukraine be defeated, because this is an illegal invasion in crossing internationally recognized territories. And no country can stand by that. And no democracy, no democratic regional organization can stand by that. We saw even in the case of Cambodia, when it felt that, Preva here was under threat, or when it felt that the Lao were incurring into Cambodia, it took military action and diplomatic action and resolved the issues diplomatically. If the issues of the invasion of Ukraine cannot be resolved diplomatically, they will be resolved militarily. I believe that Europe will scale up with its security autonomy, but its independence, looking at the threat of a reduction in the US security umbrella. Many of the states in Europe, 3 of the states in Europe, are also nuclear powers. So in Europe, not only the EU, Britain is not in the EU. But we see that Europe has already committed to support Ukraine. I believe that whatever the US does, it cannot pull 100% of its support from Ukraine, because I believe even Donald Trump, an executive presidency in a democracy, doesn't even have the capacity to do that. It's not like an autocracy where Putin can declare what position will be taken. So I'm confident that in the end, after a long term, there will be a solution, but there's a long way to go. And I believe that Ukraine, in defending its territorial integrity, will be victorious in the end with the support of Europe.
So thank you, Professor. Moving on, recently we have observed that some experts and scholars around the world have put forth their perspective towards the possibility of ending the war. However, the response differs sharply in some cases that demonstrate a divided world approach to a complex situation between Ukraine and Russia. And those responses are organized into 3 categories, if I can including the call for additional financial and military support for Ukraine, and the second one, pathway for the diplomacy and a ceasefire, and lastly, how to rethink the current mindsets of the conflict. So on this ground, how do you perceive and evaluate the approaches for the possibility of containing or ending the war?
Well, I don't see the scope for ending the war immediately. I think that the war could be ended overnight if Russia returned to its own internationally recognized territorial boundaries. It's not prepared to do that. I think there could be some possibility of an opening for discussion if it returned to its pre-2014 boundaries. That's a possibility. There may be some scope for discussion. But at the moment, I don't see any negotiating positions opening. Both actors hold zero-sum objectives. As I've said, Europe, and currently under Biden, the United States, sees that the appeasement of Russia in its invasion of Ukraine is not an objective, that this threatens all of Europe and beyond. So I don't see a resolution, probably not under Putin. And I don't see a scope for negotiation, probably not while Putin is in charge. It'd be like looking for solutions in Israel under Netanyahu at the moment. There are personalities at play here that don't have that movement, don't have that capacity to move, and don't have the ability to compromise or to lose. So I'm not expecting peace talks anytime soon.
So in this connection, recently you have also doing a research on the crisis as well, and I'd like to hear from your perspective. How do you define the scenario in this prolonged issue in the future, in the short and long terms?
Well, I think that we're looking at Europe that is building up its capacity. I do not believe that the United States will withdraw from NATO. So there will be United States support there. I think that that might be a bridge too far even for Trump, should he win. And it's not certain he will win, though the opinion polls say he will. But of course, the opinion polls are affected by the misinformation war as well that Russia is waging. So I see a long ongoing conflict, possibly pushing back to the pre-2024 before there is some kind of a frozen conflict, which is fairly traditional in the pre-fall of the Soviet Union time. Frozen wars were traditional ways of dealing with conflict. Just freeze them, leave them as they are, and stop killing one another for the time being while they think of something better to do. I think that's one option. The other option is pushing Russia back to its unrecognized international territorial boundaries. And that's unlikely to happen under Putin. But Putin will not live forever.
So, on the other hand, the conflict has also been a concern for ASEAN. If we talk about ASEAN framework, somehow it causes internal division among ASEAN member states, and as the war is pushing the region and the world to the cliff, what is your perception towards the potential implication to ASEAN and beyond?
Yeah. Well, ASEAN was never an integrated organization as regards foreign policy or anything else for that matter. Always the international integrity was a basis for the operation of ASEAN, and consensus was central in all the decisions. Now, on the spectrum of ASEAN attitudes towards Ukraine, there are four main opinions. And at one end, you have Myanmar, that completely supports Russia because it needs Russia and it needs its arms. And on the other end, you have Singapore and the Philippines that would be considered somewhat pro-Western and that has initiated some sanctions against Russia. Now, in the middle of this line, this spectrum line, we have Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam that has historical relationships with Russia. And if we take it that Vietnam has about 60% of its weapons are Russian, and I would say it is probably reconsidering the wisdom of this when seeing the poor functioning of Russian weaponry in Ukraine. Cambodia has a traditional relationship, and Laos have a traditional relationship with Russia, so it will hedge its bets and remain. We then have Malaysia, Indonesia, Brunei, and Thailand, who take the traditional ASEAN position of absolute neutrality in relation to the activities of other countries. So we have those four different opinions within ASEAN. That's not necessarily a threat to ASEAN, because ASEAN is not an integrated organization such as the EU, where they hope to have consensus in relation to foreign policy. ASEAN countries are allowed to have different opinions, including in their foreign policy. And that's quite natural for ASEAN. And it's no major change. So this war is a problem for ASEAN as regards the price of food and commodities, but the majority of people, of ASEAN citizens, see it as a remote, Western orientated conflict that has little to do with them. They don't actually associate their increase in the cost of living with this war, which unfortunately part of it is. But the four positions along the spectrum I have mentioned are the government positions. The people don't see it as relevant to their lives. So I don't expect this war to have a major impact on how ASEAN works. We've seen that ASEAN has had difficulty in trying to deal with the situation in Myanmar. So even in dealing with an internal membership issue, ASEAN has different ideas, which hasn't exploded ASEAN in general. It has caused us some irritant and some verbal conflict between member states. But ASEAN can survive through different opinions in relation to international relations and can continue gradually to improve its integration in other areas. So from the point of view of Ukraine, it's quite remote and distant from ASEAN, but the individual relationships that governments have with Russia are what sets its foreign policy in relation to Ukraine.
You mentioned that the Russia-Ukraine conflict is indeed affect and as a big concern for ASEAN. So, if the conflict is still going long, should ASEAN do anything on its foreign policy and approach on this matter?
Well, as I said, we've seen that Singapore and the Philippines have taken a more pro-Western point of view. I don't expect the other states to join that position. I expect them, particularly Malaysia, Indonesia, Brunei, to maintain and Thailand to maintain independent positions. And I expect that Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam will retain their current positions. So I don't see any major change. I see ASEAN countries hedging their bets somewhat to see how this will come out. Even China is hedging its bets, both in relation to Myanmar and in relation to Russia. Though China has a big influence on Cambodia, Laos, China is happy to have a stronger Russia that holds the attention of NATO while it deals with issues in its own sphere of influence. So I think we'll see no major change in the position of ASEAN countries as regards the war in Ukraine.
So thank you, Professor. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, our interview program has now come to an end, and once again, I would like to pay my sincere appreciation to Professor Desmond Malloy for your valuable time and your kind contribution to our interview program today.
Thanks very much.
So goodbye, please stay safe and have a nice day.